I'm Professor Owen Anderson, and in this interview, I'm talking with Pastor Doug Wilson. And I especially want to invite Christian men to think about the things we're talking about because the interview revolves around the idea of Christians at secular universities and the challenges that Christians are going to face there. And there's a good chance that you're either going to go to a secular university or you may have children that go to them. And you need to be prepared for yourself and for raising up your family to know what are the challenges I'm going to face and how can I successfully defend my Christian beliefs, and not only defend as if we're always on the defensive, but also how to share my Christian beliefs in a very hostile environment that is the secular university of our day. So I think you're going to really benefit and enjoy this interview. Please leave a comment telling me about your thoughts and make sure to share the video. Well, thanks for joining me, Pastor Wilson. And I'd reached out to you to ask about your views on DEI at state universities. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about today is the condition, I'm going to call it secular universities, which I mean, these are usually state universities like Arizona State or University of Idaho, but it could include Harvard, MIT, in contrast to private religious schools, which would be a whole different discussion. But I wanted to get your take on how did state universities, secular universities, get into such a bad place? So I'm right now involved in a lawsuit against Arizona State for compelled speech by requiring professors to take DEI training. And ASU presents the DEI training as if it's just a great way to learn how to work together with people that you might disagree with. Any big employer will need to have people learn problem solving skills and work with lots of people, so that's understandable. But the actual content of this DEI training involves doing things like race blame. People are blamed for things that happened in the past based on their skin color, or a gender philosophy that says there are an infinite number of genders, and if you believe there's only two, you're a bigot. So I said, hey, wait a minute, this is very objectionable. It's clearly discriminating against the Christian beliefs. So you've seen this. We've seen this going on, and you interact with University of Idaho. Give us your take on this stuff.
Yes, this is another example of the inescapable concept. And the inescapable concept is constructed this way. It's not whether, but which. Okay? It's not whether, but which. It's not whether a society is going to be theocratic, but rather which theo is going to be the god of that system.
Yeah.
It's not whether law is the imposition of morality, because all law, by definition, is an imposed moral system. It's which morality. It's not whether, but which.
Yep.
Okay. So it's not whether the people at Arizona are going to be catechized. It's which it's which catechism. Right?
Yep.
Are we going to use the Westminster Shorter Catechism, or are we going to use the woke catechism of the modern secularist era?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, if you and we have to go back to first principles with this. If there is no God above the system, then the system is God. Okay. If there is no God above the state, then the state is God. If there is no transcendent authority above us all, outranking us all and overarching us all, then that authority is now dragged down into this enclosed room, meaning that might makes right.
Yeah.
Whoever's got the power, whoever's got the position, whoever's hiring, they control everything.
Yeah.
And that means they can impose whatever it is they're feeling for whatever historic reasons, which might change tomorrow. Okay. So they can impose it's arbitrary, it's capricious, and what they're enjoying is the adrenaline rush of the exercise of power.
Yeah.
Okay. So the fact that it's and it takes me back to Orwell's 1984, where if there is no God above the system, if there is no final judgment, and everything is being conducted from within the system, where all authority is imminent, that means that it doesn't have to be consistent.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't have to be consistent. They could reverse everything tomorrow.
Yep.
And say, okay,
well, there's infinite genders. So he,
infinite genders, and then they can go back to nope, there's only one, or there's only two, or there's 28. Basically, uh, Chesterton probably didn't actually say this, but he should have. If he, I don't think people have been able to track it down, but he said if you're not willing to stand for something, you will fall for anything.
yeah,
Okay, and that's what we have because um, traditionalists, let me call them, as opposed to Christians who understand that God made the world and we must obey Him. Traditionalists are just they've gone on the old way on sort of cruise control on autopilot, and then there's been this massive revolution underneath their feet where one
yeah,
religious faith has been substituted in for another. It's
yeah,
a secular relativistic faith, but it's been substituted in for the old Christian faith that our country was founded on. And then all of a sudden, people are acting in line with this new faith of theirs, and the traditionalists have been caught flat-footed. Wait, what? What do you mean an infinite number of genders? Wait,
yeah,
that's not what I learned in biology class. That's not what you guys taught me back
yeah,
in biology class. Well, they
yeah.
changed.
Yeah. Well, and right, we were in secular biology, we were taught that the purpose of evolution is reproduction.
Right.
And now I guess that doesn't matter anymore. So yeah, it's interesting to see the contradictions of the people who get power in a secular university because they'll start off by saying it's wrong to judge anybody based on their skin color. And we all said, yeah, that sounds great. You're absolutely right. And then once they're in power, they say, well, there is some judgments we can make based on skin color.
Yeah.
Or they'll say, when you're in charge, you shouldn't impose your beliefs. But then as soon as they get in charge, they begin imposing their beliefs. In my school, we start every faculty meeting, and faculty meetings are just meant to be about business, enrollment, things like that. We start every faculty meeting with what they call a Native American land acknowledgement, where we acknowledge that ASU is on Native American land and not, I guess, United States land. And we have to read that every single time we start a meeting. And it's just like the Lord's Prayer or a creed at church. This is what the secularists say. Yes, this is my ritual, and you have to participate. I've said, hey, why don't we do something else, or why don't we rotate it? Each of us gets to read something different. And they said, nope, this is the only thing we're doing.
Well, one of the things I would do in a situation like that, depending on how impish you are feeling, or would be, if someone stole my car, I wouldn't feel better if on the other side of town, every morning they got up and they read a statement saying, I recognize that I stole
I
this
know,
car.
exactly. I've said the same thing. I've said, you can give your house back at any time you want.
Right.
Right? It's easy to speak for ASU because you don't own ASU, but your house is on that same land. Give it back.
Yeah. In fact, make a motion. I move. I move that the faculty
Yeah.
recommend to the university that we return this university to the indigenous peoples.
Yeah, right. But
Right.
that's how much of this works is just posturing to say, look, I believe the right things, but I'm not going to actually do anything that would change my life about them.
Right. Right.
But that's
And
what's fascinating is what you were getting at about authority. They sell the bill of goods that says, well, this is democracy. We're not going to impose beliefs, but as soon as they're in charge, they're imposing beliefs. We've got the pride flag flying at the White House.
correct. Now, there's another aspect to this. This whole thing is a rat's nest of conflicting motivations, and there's the theological apologetics issue I was just talking about, the not whether but which. But there's also the personal element, and that is a people who've been living the way we have been living here in America for the last 50 years, let's say. The millions, tens of millions of abortions, the homosexual behavior, the child pornography, just all the gunk, right?
Mm-hmm.
There has to be massive amounts of guilt. Okay, massive amounts of guilt that is unresolved. It's all unresolved,
Yeah,
and it's a reservoir of guilt that is not addressed. The
yeah,
problem is that people don't like feeling guilty,
right.
but they don't like repenting either.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. That makes that
the,
internal mental conflict.
correct. So they want to do something to feel like they're being righteous, to feel like the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's where all this posturing and this virtue signaling comes from.
Yeah.
It's it's a psychological, emotional need.
Mhm.
Okay. Someone's had 3 abortions and they're trying to fix it by buying fair trade coffee.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Mhm.
They're trying to fix it by uh, setting themselves up as virtuous, righteous
Mhm.
people. And the best way to project that is to find someone else who's worse.
Yeah.
Like in
Right.
the
Yep.
in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And so what they're doing is they're looking around. What they're doing is they're looking around for um, a scapegoat,
Yeah.
someone that they can say, "Well, I may not be much, but I'm not as bad as
Yeah.
I'm not as bad as the white Klan members. I'm
Yeah.
not as bad as the white supremacists."
Yeah.
And so you have and this is again in Orwell, uh, the sort of 2-minute hate, right? You have these little rituals that project your virtue
Mhm.
and the misdeeds of others,
Yeah,
and
that's a great point.
so you don't have to repent, and you can still feel virtuous. But
Mhm.
at the end of the day, it's sort of like holding an overinflated beach ball underwater, and your arms are quivering.
Mhm.
That's why people have such. This is why they fly into a rage so
Mhm.
quickly. Is
Yeah.
like they're holding the beach ball underwater and their arms are quivering, and you come up and start poking at their arms. Hey, what's
Yeah.
this? What's going on here?
Yeah.
And they'll blow up at you,
Yeah.
and they'll blow up at you because they are consumed with guilt.
Well, and
And
that's what we see from statistics, right? Is that like on college campuses, depression, anxiety, mental illness is through the roof. And so on
yeah,
campuses like mine, they spend a lot of time trying to help address mental illness, but they never get to the spiritual side of it that you're addressing.
right, exactly. And at the end of the day, everybody's wherever you go, there you are. You know, so transsexual surgeries are another issue where um, when you look at the suicide rate among um, people in that with that condition or that problem post surgery, it's through the roof, right?
Mhm.
In other words, they are flailing, trying to get at something that will fix this. Anything, what will fix it? Anything but Jesus, basically.
Yeah, right. Yep.
Anything but Jesus. And so I'm going to attack and vilify and scapegoat and blame, and then puff myself up for uh, recycling my trash. You know, I'm saving the planet. What are you doing?
Yeah, right,
Um,
exactly.
right,
And then we find out that the trash is all shipped to China, which makes
right,
more pollution, and they don't end up recycling anyway.
right, right,
So yeah, well, let me back up real quick because one of the things that's fascinating about you, many people when they hear about you, they say, okay, yeah, Pastor Doug Wilson, or maybe that you're involved in theology, theologian, but you actually have your degrees from a secular university. So you went to the University of Idaho and
right,
did bachelor's degrees in philosophy and classics, and then a master's degree in philosophy. I
right.
wanted to know a little bit about your time there. Was it back? This is the '70s. Was that a favorable place for Christians then?
It was no, not favorable, but it was doable.
Mhm.
Okay. The country had not yet lost their mind,
Mhm.
right? And so I had one secular man a professor who worked on he was my thesis advisor for my master's degree, who was a very capable, fair-minded guy. I just uh, really enjoyed working with him. But there was another fellow there in the philosophy department who, if he had been my thesis advisor, it would have been more of a rodeo,
Yeah.
right? So there was that. There was also it's sort of like we are in the throes of childbirth now in our culture, and back then we were just 2 months pregnant,
Yeah.
right?
We're on the way. Yeah.
All the stuff was there, everything was there, and we did things that were sort of out there. We had some pro-life a pro-life movement where we ran pro-life cartoons in the student paper, and people got really irate over it.
Really. Huh. Because
Really,
you think Idaho, like Arizona, is still kind of a conservative place.
yeah.
But
Idaho is a conservative state, but Moscow is, because the university's here, with a little blue dot
Yeah,
in,
that's how it
in,
is here.
in
Yeah.
a red state.
Yep.
And there's
Yeah,
one.
people don't realize that we have to, the universities have to hire nationally, so they don't bring in local people. They bring in professors who are trained in this stuff.
Right. And so at the University of Idaho, the forestry School of Forestry was real good, and School of Engineering was real good, but the humanities was shot through with the same kind of nonsense that you see everywhere else.
Yeah.
But one amusing story from that time, I mentioned that we were running these pro-life cartoons. We called No Joke Comics,
Hmm.
and people were just beside themselves over
Really?
it. And but this was back in the day when they would actually run the comic, right?
Yeah.
Today,
You weren't censored.
yeah, we weren't censored. Everybody would yell about it afterwards. Well, I was newly married, and one day when we were going to run the comic, we didn't have something, so I just ran a little announcement saying if anybody wanted to talk with us about these things, I know people are upset, and I put our phone number in the thing to talk with anybody who wanted to talk. The problem was, as a newlywed chump husband, I forgot to tell my wife that that our phone number was going to be in the student newspaper, and she was a young mom, and we had one kid at the time, and she got this hostile phone call from someone. Yeah, I don't like your cartoons at all. And Nancy is quick on the uptake, and so she started talking to him on the phone and said, well, do you believe that murder is wrong? And he was wanting to be a consistent relativist. He said, no, not always. Do you believe that rape is wrong? He would say, no, not always.
Wow.
Do you think that theft is wrong? He said, no, not always. And then Nancy said, so how can you say our cartoons are wrong?
Wow.
And then there was silence on the other end of the line. And then he said, well, you got me there.
Good. Wow. At
Because
least he was honest.
at least he's honest. Because if relativism is the case, then anything goes,
Hmm.
including the worst forms of absolutism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
If the scare quotes white supremacists are out to get everybody,
Hmm.
then if there is no God, what's your problem?
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
The,
Well,
you can't have it both ways.
that's what my colleagues, at least some of them, would begin that way and say, no, there are standards. We have facts on our side about how that's harmful. But once you get past like level 1 or 2 of their defense, it just turns into it's their personal preference. So they don't actually have any foundation to stand on, but they
Right.
aren't yet at the place where they want to say anything goes. They want to say, no, only some things are good and some things aren't, because I think that goes back to your point of addressing their conscience.
Yeah.
And
My son, N.D. Wilson, is a novelist, and he had his with Random House and HarperCollins, and he had one series of books that involved time travel adventure. And in one climactic scene, the bad guys were the Aztecs sacrificing humans on top of their pyramids,
Mhm.
and there was a big showdown there. And he had a massive fight with one of his editors
Hmm.
over
Yeah, I
him
bet.
making the Aztecs the bad guys,
Yeah, I bet.
right? Well, because these are indigenous peoples, and we can't impose our morality on them.
Yeah.
Well, see, this is another uh, inescapable concept, not whether but which.
Yeah.
So, at the end of the day, someone is going to impose on someone. And so, for example, if I'm arguing a pro-life position, someone's going to say, "Well, what you're doing is you want to impose your morality on the doctor and on the mother." And I would say, "Yes, that's correct. That's what I want to do. All
Mhm.
laws impose morality,
Yeah, right. Yep.
right? And I want the morality that we are imposing to be the correct one, the true one. And so you're right. I do want to tell the doctor, no, you can't do that. And I do want to tell the mother, no, you can't do that.
Mhm.
But I hasten to add, and this is the important thing, I hasten to add, at the end of the day, you're doing the same thing.
Yeah,
At the
that's
end of the
right.
day, the doctor and the mother, in your view, get to impose your morality on the child.
Mhm.
Someone is going to be
Yeah, and the
imposing.
father many times who says, "I don't want that to happen."
Correct. So there's no way that uh, with all these jostling interests that we have in a world full of sinners,
Mhm.
where you need some sort of standard to adjudicate between people.
Yeah.
Okay. You need some sort of standard that applies to everyone. And I
Yeah.
believe that that standard ought not to be standards that I cook up in my own
Yeah.
head or the
Yep.
standards that you cook up in your own head.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to see how all of law, like you said, is imposing a standard or compelling. So, for example, don't murder. That's from the
Right.
Ten Commandments, and our
Right.
state imposes that on people.
Right.
Or to much less important, but still a law they impose: don't speed. And if you say, well, you don't drive in my neighborhood, so you don't understand what it's like to be me. I have to speed in my neighborhood. The
You don't
judge
know that
doesn't
I'm late.
care. Yeah, the judge doesn't care. You were speeding.
Yeah.
So that's a really silly argument to say don't impose your morality on me. I mean, that would end up in just kind of an anarchist situation. But the other thing I notice about these new sexual philosophies is it seems like you can almost always identify a cult because they come along and they say, "Hey, we've figured out how to do sex right, and it will give you a better life." That
Right.
almost always seems, I mean, 9 times out of 10, that's like their leading selling point. And
Right.
that goes all the way back to the Moabites and Israel.
Yeah. That's right. Um, what you want to do when you want to when you want to recruit people, when you want the fish to bite the hook, you bait the hook.
Yeah.
Right. And you put things out there that everybody wants at some level, some way, and you configure it in a way that makes it attractive to them, and you invite them to come along. So
Yeah.
yes, that's very much the case. The other thing that I wanted to throw in here, connecting it to the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is and a lot of Christians don't recognize that this is what's going on, because equality is a good word.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with equal treatment under the law. Um, but there's a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome.
Yeah.
Okay. So equality of opportunity means that you have an official standing by the starting line with a starter's pistol and a stopwatch, and he fires the gun into the air, and he makes sure that all the runners are lined up behind the same line. They're lined up in the correct place. He makes sure that they all start at the same time. Okay, that's equality of opportunity. But the progressive left wants equality of outcome.
Mhm.
They want everyone to cross the finish line at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Or
And
some
what that
groups to finish first because of past injustices.
Yeah, correct. And that's why if you have that commitment of equality of outcome, which is where the propaganda, that's how they bait the hook in the first place.
Mhm.
Who could be against equality of outcome? Well, anybody who understands that in order to get that photo finish at the end of every race, you're going to have to be hampering, cheating,
Mhm.
tripping up runners.
Yeah.
Because if you have a fair race, somebody's going to be faster.
Mhm.
Somebody's going to finish first. And if you want everybody to finish at the same time, then you've got to start manipulating. Well, as
Yeah.
soon as you start manipulating the race to make sure that everybody finishes at the same time, the officials, being fallen, selfish human beings, also, they're going to start to want their guy to win first.
Yeah.
All right. So instead of letting the fastest person finish first, they
Mhm.
want the person that they want to
Yeah. Yep.
finish first, which is where affirmative action and all the DEI stuff comes in. The rhetoric is equality, equality, equality,
Mhm.
but there's nothing even-handed about what they're doing at all.
Yeah. Well, what my colleagues would say is that the word they use is equity. So they would say equality is what you described, but equity means that, for example, you mentioned your son, and he started life off with a mom and a dad, a stable income, got to go to schools that were good for him or he wasn't. No one was prejudiced against him. And so the starting place isn't equal compared to someone else who had maybe just a single mom who had to work all day and they didn't have enough money and they went to
Right.
schools that weren't very good. And so they would say, because of that, of course, he's being successful. Now, what's interesting to me is when I hear that story, one thing that comes to mind is, well, okay, let's fix the family life then. We need to get the families back together
Yeah.
so that you don't have that situation. But now what they're doing, what the DEI people do, is they say, no, that's actually racism. That's whiteness. That's their term they use, whiteness. And you're imposing a family standard on others. This
Right.
person should be able to succeed without any of those other things.
Right. And so but here's the thing, and there's two steps to this. They say this is you're describing white privilege. So
Mhm.
my son has all this white privilege. I had white privilege, but one of the things that Christians should know how to do is when I have a privilege that I didn't earn, I should my response to that should be not guilt but gratitude.
Mhm.
So I grew up in a family where my parents were together my whole life. They never divorced. I didn't grow up with a single parent.
Mhm.
Um, my there were four of us kids. They cared for us. They fed us. They loved us. They read to us, and that was an enormous privilege, which I believe I'm supposed to thank God for.
Mhm.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm supposed to thank God for my privilege. Now, if I have privileges because my grandfather stole some property from the next door neighbor, right? Then that is ill-gotten privilege, and that's where the biblical doctrine of restitution comes in. But reparations is aimed at simply the way things are now, without
Right. Yeah.
any allegation of individual wrongdoing. So when when you have so here's the way to illustrate um, the principle and why I think envy is the driving engine of all of this.
Yeah.
Okay,
Coveting. Yeah.
coveting, envy. Um, let's say we were talking about problems in our town. Let's say you and I lived in the same town, and there was a bad side of town. A bunch of poor people lived there, and I put a magic button in front of you, and I said, "Look, I won't tell you where I got this button, but if you push that button, every poor person in town is going to be 2 times better off tomorrow morning, in real terms.
Mhm.
Twice as much money. They have one car. They're going to have two cars. If
Yeah.
it's 10 years old, it's going to be 5 years old. Their house is
Mhm.
going to have twice the square footage. It's a magic button, I tell you.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
and so if you push this button, then you're going to make every poor person's life 2 times better off this time tomorrow. And you would look at me narrow-eyed, squinty, okay, and you'd say, as you should say, so what's the catch? What's the
Yeah.
catch? The catch is every rich person on the other side of town is going to be 10 times better off. If if you push that button,
Yeah.
every poor person is going to be 2 times better off, and every rich person is going to be 10 times better off.
Yeah. That was a
Now,
rough push.
and a lot of people would hesitate
Yeah.
and say, I can't push that button,
Yeah.
because if you push the button, what you've just done is you've increased income inequality. The inequality gets bigger.
Mhm.
Now, what that tells me is the inequality is not a problem,
Yeah.
right? I would say
Right. It's the
what
end.
is
Yeah.
the only people who would see that as a problem are people who are envious.
Yeah.
Why should he have all that? Why couldn't I have 10 times as much?
Yeah.
Well, look, just be grateful that you got this
Yeah.
windfall. You're two
Well, great.
times
That's
better
right.
off.
Gratitude is not a virtue that we teach at all.
Right,
And coveting and coveting is justified because, well, they got it the wrong way.
right,
And so what you said was important, that it then make an individual accusation and take someone to court. But they can't do that, so they back up to a systematic claim. It's all systematic, and the
right.
proof of that is different outcomes. But
And
they never
then
fact. Go ahead.
then at the end of the day, that what they're doing is they're saying is how you got it. Well, how did I get this inequitable arrangement? Well, it turns out your great 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 grandfather was friends with a slave trader. Okay,
Yeah.
um, so I'm blamed for something a distant ancestor did,
Mhm. Or
and this
even just
person,
someone with the same skin color, maybe not even an ancestor.
right, correct. Some white guy whose grandparents just moved from Finland 20 years ago and had nothing to do with anything. They're blamed because of their skin tint. And then the person I'm talking to we might have video surveillance of him burning down a store in a riot. And so, as the great Thomas Sowell once said, we are now in the position of blaming people for things their distant ancestors did, while refusing to blame people for
Yeah.
things that they themselves are doing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And thinking about the doubling the poor, but multiplying by 10 the rich. I've been suggesting for a while that the first class every freshman should take at the university is Economics 101. And I
Yeah,
mean taught by a real economist, not by a humanist,
right.
because there's no concept of inflation either, or what these things do to the actual value of what you own.
Right.
But that's a pet project of mine. Logic and economics are the two ones I want every freshman to take right away. So
Amen.
now, but tell me, I brought up your education at Second University. What were some of the benefits you got from studying philosophy?
Um, my intention was the reason I studied philosophy is I wanted to go into ministry. Not I wound up as a pastor, but that wasn't the plan at the time. My father pioneered the use of Christian bookstores in university towns as evangelistic outposts.
Mhm.
And so my
Yeah, we had a
plan,
great one in Tempe.
yes, Elmer Hebert, who got my father to move to Idaho, is
Wow.
the man who moved to Tempe and started that bookstore there.
Wow.
Um, anyway, my plan was to come to college, get my degree, and then I was going to go to somewhere like Laramie or some small college town and do what my father had done here in Moscow and Pullman, open up a Christian bookstore and interact with unbelieving students evangelistically and as an apologist. I wanted to be an apologist for the Christian faith. And I didn't want to be telling people, well, no, Buddhism is wrong because it begins with a B. and
Mhm.
and I'm a Christian and it begins
Actually,
with
have
a
good, yeah,
C.
arguments.
Right. I wanted to study um, all the alternative worldviews, so that when I had these encounters, evangelistic encounters with people, I knew what I was talking about.
Hmm.
So I studied philosophy for that reason, not because I was interested in adopting any of these views myself, but
Right.
because uh, I wanted to steel man my discussion partners, not straw man them. So
Yeah.
I didn't want to have caricatures of secularism or a caricature of a pantheist. I wanted to be trained in the
Yeah.
best that these worldviews had to offer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's really similar to what I was thinking because all my degrees are from secular universities, philosophy, history, religious studies. And it was the same idea. I want to hear what are the best ideas out there and be
Right.
challenged. And at least when I was at the tail end, I think, of what they used to call multiculturalism. So my degrees were all still in this idea that there's just lots of different views. We don't really know at the end of the day. So maybe Christianity is true, maybe it's not. I think most of my professors were not Christians. I had a couple really good Christian professors. And multiculturalism now is viewed as a bad thing because the idea is no, there are some cultures that are wrong, like Christian culture,
Okay.
anything that came out of Europe, and there's some cultures that are better. And that was in my day, that was a thing you'd argue against. Professors would say, no, no, they're all equal. Don't
Right.
put any of them down. Now it's completely reversed. So in one way, it's funny to say I miss the old days of multiculturalism at state universities.
Yeah. Right. Right. It's before the demons all came out in order to demonize.
Yeah.
Um, and I regard the war on whiteness as not a war on whiteness per se, but in the providence of God, and this is simply how history unfolded. In the providence of God, the Christian gospel spread west and north and took deepest root in Europe. There were missionaries to China and so forth early on, but it didn't really take in those other places the same way it took in Europe. And so consequently, the dismissal of Eurocentric views or white Europeans or Anglo-Saxon, all of that I regard as a proxy war
Yeah, I think you're
against
right.
against Christianity.
Yep.
It's a handy flag. If you're North American, if you're a North American white person, the odds are pretty good that you are a downstream descendant of Christian culture,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so consequently, when you get attacked, and the person attacking you might be attacking you because you were flying that flag of being white,
Hmm.
that is not sufficient, in my view, to account for the venom and the hostility.
Yeah.
Um, I think that white people are a stand-in representative of Christian culture,
Hmm.
um, and so the
I think yeah, that's
close
absolutely right.
the closest representation of Christian culture that we have would be European Anglo-American
Hmm.
culture. Now, I'm not saying this in any kind of rah-rah way. as though we have arrived, because I believe that there are warts and blemishes in every direction, and Christians above all should be willing to confess their sins. And
And no one will quote you on that part. They'll just
yeah,
quote you on
no,
the first part.
yeah, they'll quote me on the first part, but not on the second part. So I don't think we've in any sense arrived. But given the 2,000 years of history, um, white European Anglo-American culture has been the closest approach to what the gospel will do to a society, right? Um, over time. Now, let's say the evangelization of Africa proceeds apace, and let's say uh, European culture falls into complete apostasy,
Yeah.
and let's say American Christianity falls into complete apostasy, and then there's a vibrant Christian movement in Africa. Well, God haters are going to hate them too,
Yeah.
right?
Well, that's right. That's what I thought too, is the arguments that are put out there about injustices in the past, you can see that they're not sincere, because when you point out, well, wait a minute, other cultures did equal or worse of that same injustice,
Yeah,
they'll say, well, yeah, but they'll dismiss that somehow. And if you point out, well, I mean, look, the United States fought a war to end slavery,
yeah,
and that wasn't happening anywhere else, they'll say, yeah, but they'll dismiss all those. And I think you're right. It really comes down to their problem is with the Christian missionaries and the gospel.
right.
And they may not, I don't think my colleagues are necessarily aware of that. There might be some that are more conscious than others, but there's something when they hear the gospel, something in them that says, no, I've got to fight against that.
Right. To quote the great Thomas Sowell again, he said slavery has been ubiquitous throughout all human history. Human societies have owned slaves, trafficked in slaves, dealt with slaves. Um, During the slaving era, more Europeans were kidnapped from Europe and taken to Africa on the north coast by slavers. The word slave comes from Slav, right? There were slavery raids as far north as Ireland, and the slave traffic of whites being taken to Africa as slaves was happening while also blacks were being trafficked from the west coast of Africa. Okay, slavery was something. This is something that fallen, sinful human people do.
Yeah.
And Sowell pointed out that it was in the Western Christian, well, first with under Wilberforce, an evangelical Christian who oversaw the outlawing of the slave trade in the British Empire, which was followed shortly after that by the power of the British Navy being used to suppress the slave trade everywhere. So what Sowell points out is that slavery is universal throughout all human history. And he said one culture developed a bad conscience about it, and then fought and suppressed slavery. Mm-hmm. And that culture is uniquely blamed as a slaving culture. Yeah. It's the one culture that outlawed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think it kind of reminds me of when Apollyon is fighting Christian, and Apollyon brings up in Pilgrim's Progress and brings up all these sins that Christian has done. And Christian says, yeah, I did those things and more than you know.
Yeah.
But because of Christ, I can be redeemed. Yeah. And I think that's the part that the unbelievers don't understand. The non-Christians don't get that. And that precisely why they're not Christians. But let me ask you about this. Christ Church recently had an event at the University of Idaho.
Yes.
And this was a time to anybody could come, but especially students or faculty, and come and ask you questions. And I noticed interesting things came up. That's on your YouTube channel. People want to watch it.
Yeah.
Interesting things stood out to me is that the questions I would want to ask if I was, say, a non-Christian and didn't like what you guys are doing would be about the truth of your doctrines. And I feel like when I was a freshman philosophy student, that's the kind of thing I saw atheists doing. They would say it's absurd to believe in God. The universe has always existed. There's no creator. And they would give arguments. And William Lane Craig would march out and he'd give counter arguments. Right. But for you, it was all slanders and smears.
Yes.
So they brought up, you guys trying to compel Christianity on the whole town, right. Or they brought up that you guys don't handle church discipline the right way. Do you get any actual debates about the truth of Christian doctrine?
Very, very little. So back in this, I was just talking with someone else about this earlier today. In fact, back in the 70s, when Francis Schaeffer was ministering, the pressing question on college campuses was, what is truth?
Yeah.
What is truth? And today, the pressing question is, where is community?
Mhm.
Where is authenticity?
Yeah.
Um, in the old, so modernists, from Voltaire on down, Christopher Hitchens was a modernist. Modernists would say, I'm opposed to Christianity because I believe Christianity is false.
Yeah.
Okay. Evolution is true. God didn't create the world.
Right.
That's false. This is true. It was competing truth claims. Okay. Um, and what's happening today is more like, I I want authenticity. I want reality. And if I want to attack a Christian church, I have to attack them for being hypocritical or inauthentic.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Right. I have to
They're
dismiss.
bigots.
They're bigots. They're hateful. They use the language of love, but they're actually racists and so on. What they're trying to do is, just like Christopher Hitchens would try to undermine my arguments. Oh, Wilson says that this is true, but I want to attack his truth claims by by countering them with other truth claims. Um, the attacks on us now are moral claims. Now, and of course, it's inconsistent because in their worldview, there's no such thing as morality,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? But they still want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And the idea of authenticity, it seems like the victory of secular existentialism, where
Yes,
you make your own meaning, you determine for yourself before you have an essence, you determine your essence for yourself. And that's especially come down on the idea of gender. You get to determine what kind of gender you are, although there are some who deal with species, also speciesism, and you can
yeah,
even determine what species you are.
right. Or
And
yeah,
so
yeah, and that's where the furries come from. And then you think, okay, is there a break on this thing? Are we going to just keep going until the whole thing tumbles into the abyss? And it's starting to look that way because there's
yeah,
no consistent stopping point between
that's right.
us and the outer darkness.
Well,
There's
that
no
isn't
stopping point.
exactly what happens with sin, right? Unless the Lord puts a break on it, either through work of the Holy Spirit and regeneration or on judgment, it just keeps going until it hits that abyss.
Correct. Right. And that's why I think the only real answer, the only real response is reformation and revival.
Mhm.
Preach the gospel. As I said in a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, are there is no political solution to
Right.
the disease that ails us. There is no political solution. Now, I do want to say, so politics is no savior, but politics will be saved when
Yeah. Right.
politics needs a savior. And all the nonsense that you're going through at Arizona, that needs to be repented and that needs to be dropped. And
Mhm.
that salvation needs to come to that area. But
Yeah.
proposing a good policy instead of the crazy ones that you're confronting, that's not going to get adopted. The energy is going to have to come from elsewhere.
Yeah. Right. Well, and that I'm glad you brought that up because when people want to attack you, what they'll say is, "Oh, Doug Wilson, he's the Christian nationalist." And what they mean by Christian nationalism really is white nationalism. And so I have a related story. Last spring, there was an event at ASU with TPUSA, and they brought in Dennis Prager and Robert Kiyosaki, and of course, Charlie Kirk moderated. And the vast majority of our honors college wrote a letter to our administration saying, don't allow these guys to speak. They're white nationalists. And so I got to know through that event Charlie Kirk and Dennis Prager and Robert Kiyosaki, and I told Dennis Prager, "Yeah, they think you're a white nationalist." And he just laughed and said, "Yeah, that's the first time I've been called a Zionist, but never a white nationalist." And then the
Right.
same with Robert Kiyosaki. He's a Japanese American who
Right.
fought in Vietnam, a helicopter pilot. So that goes back to what you're saying about authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
You're just a bigoted white nationalist because based on your skin color. But what you just said refutes that because you've already said Christianity includes all peoples of the world, and that politics is not the way that we're going to make the world Christian. It's through evangelism.
Yeah. And when Larry Elder was running for office in California a few years ago, there was an article that said he was the blackface of white nationalism.
Oh yeah, they'll do that for sure. They don't like Thomas Sowell at all.
Right.
Yeah, and I got also really nice to meet Shelby Steele last fall,
Uh-huh.
And same thing. I mean, he's eminent scholar, can't get better, but he doesn't have the right views on this
Right.
stuff. So, but what do you, how do you think about the state then? How would you refute that claim that, well, he's just a white nationalist who wants to impose his beliefs on others by making people go to church on Sunday?
Depending on the format, depending on the situation, I might employ what's called a reductio. I'd say, first, what you're saying is not true, but you're also saying there is no God. So if there is no God, what's
Mhm.
wrong with it?
Yeah. Yeah. Just catch
What,
them in that contradiction.
yeah,
Yeah.
what's your objection to white nationalism? We're just meat, bones, and protoplasm running around. This is just one gaudy spectacle. What there is no God. To quote Macbeth, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. What does it matter to you? Why does it matter to you
Yeah.
that white nationalists might take over? Who cares, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Christians start making go to church on Sunday, and then we all die, and the earth is absorbed into the sun, and the
right,
sun becomes a black hole, and it's
right.
all over. Who cares?
Right. And at that point, I like to quote John Lennon's song Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven, uh, no hell below us. Above Buchenwald, only sky.
Yeah.
Above Auschwitz, only sky. Above all those abortion clinics, only sky. I would say, given your worldview, the universe absolutely does not care about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
So why do you?
Yeah.
Why do you
Yeah.
care?
Kind of. That's great both to refute it, that you're not arguing for imposing Christianity through the state, and then also to basically deconstruct, to use one of their terms, their
Right.
own position.
Right. And I would say you obviously care very intensely. You care very much. But given your premises, your foundational premises, you have no basis for caring. But
Mhm.
and yet you continue to care. And let me tell you why you continue to care. It's because you're created in the image of God.
Mhm.
And you are in rebellion against the God in his image you are.
Yeah.
And so consequently, that leaves you with a host of unresolved tensions, and you need to repent and believe. And then after you repent and believe, one of the things you will repent of is calling me a white nationalist.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Yeah, and really that comes back to the idea of a secular or state university, because you've done exceptionally well starting schools, K through graduate school, and offering alternatives to Christians. But the truth of the matter is state universities were founded for a purpose to make university education accessible and affordable to people. And many Christians are going to send their kids or choose themselves to go to state universities. And one thing I've been arguing is that the idea of the secular doesn't it shouldn't mean the anti-Christian. And I think
Correct.
your experience and my experience were more like multiculturalism, where there's just a bunch of different views. But really, what I would like to see, and I want to run this by you to get your thoughts on it, is that the secular really is a reference to general revelation. And as Christians, we believe general revelation clearly reveals God. And so, at the end of the day, if we're using reason to understand general revelation, we shouldn't be opposed to the idea that the
Yeah.
university is a place where we come to conclusions about God.
Yeah. So secular in my if I were not in a battle with the secularists or with secularism, and we were in more of a Christian consensus era,
Mhm.
it would make sense to me to say physics is a secular pursuit
Yeah.
or
Yep.
mathematics is a secular pursuit.
Yeah.
But but to say that mathematics is a secular pursuit is not the same thing as saying that it's a godless
Right.
pursuit,
Exactly.
right? So it just means that there's no baptism, there's no bread and wine, there's no
Mhm.
sermon, right?
Yeah.
So there's the sanctuary is the place that's set apart and dedicated to sacred things.
Right.
And then the outside world is the secular world,
Mhm.
not the godless world,
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
not the Christless world, but the world. It's not constant Sunday school.
Yeah. Or maybe I guess the distinction, I think the Westminster Confession in 1.1, the very first sentence captures it perfectly, that the works of creation and providence, light of nature, clearly reveal who God is, so that unbelief is without excuse. But that's not what gives you the knowledge of salvation. So there's this clear difference between general and special revelation and what their content is. But one
Right.
thing I've noticed with Christians is that they tend to either neglect or minimize general revelation.
Right.
And they're kind of afraid when they hear that you and I did degrees in philosophy. They're sort of like, oh, that might be bad.
Right.
And general revelation, at the most, if it's brought up at all, is just to hold people inexcusable. But
Right.
when we see in the Psalms, for example, our church is a psalm singing church,
Yeah.
you'll see time and time again, consider the wondrous works of God,
Right.
contemplate what God has done. And the Psalms and Job goes to God, and when God catechizes Job, so to speak, he points him to creation and
Yeah.
what it reveals about God. And it seems like Christians have let go of that.
Yeah. And they ought not. The heavens declare the glory of God. Yeah.
What is the sensus divinitatis? Thinking the audience may not know what it is.
All right. So basically, when uh, we were talking about natural revelation, God declaring his majesty and glory and wisdom in all the works out there. Uh, uh, a simple way of talking about this sensus divinitatis is to recognize that I am one of his works. I'm included in the picture,
Yeah.
right? And so there is what I see. I see the glory of God when I look at the galaxies, but I also should see, have a sense of the divine in the fact that I am able to look,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
The fact that here I am. Where did I come from? What is this?
Yeah.
Right? And the sensus divinitatis is the idea that God has embedded knowledge of Himself at some level in all of us, because
Mm-hmm.
all of us are created in the image of
Yeah.
God, and that image is not something that we can carry in ignorance. We have to be aware at some level of who made us.
Mm-hmm.
And so, consequently, um, when Paul talks in Romans 1 about a pagan looking at the majestic works of God, the reason it leaves them without excuse is he looks at the stars and says, God is great. And then from within him, there's a little teeny voice that says, Amen. And then he turns and says, Shut up to that little voice.
Yeah.
The Romans 1 describes him suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. But the truth that he's suppressing is his own knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of the truth of all of this.
Yeah. Do you think so? Would you take suppression in Romans 1 to mean a kind of inner psychological suppression? Because I've sometimes thought of it more as what we've been talking about this whole time, which is that the worldly system suppresses the gospel and the truths of God by censoring them, putting something else in its place, versus an individual says to themselves, I know God exists, but I'm not going to
Yeah.
acknowledge it.
I would want to say both and. The
Mhm.
reason the external censorship occurs is because the people who are doing the censoring have been having this internal battle. So the Bible talks about every mouth is going to be stopped at the day of judgment.
Mhm.
God's not going to look at anybody and say, "Well, I guess you had good arguments there."
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no one has good arguments.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's part of the inexcusability, and what you started off with was great. Our being made in the image of God is we can understand things. We should understand things,
Yeah,
and so we're inexcusable because whatever we put in its place amounts to an idol,
right.
right? And we can't defend it at the end of the day. So we've come at the end of our ability. We've actually denied what's clear to reason. But I think reason sometimes in the reform community, the same people who will kind of look at maybe you and me sideways about doing philosophy, they look at us sideways if we mention reason
Right.
because they've taken the doctrine of total depravity correctly, which is that all of our human nature is fallen, intellect and emotions and will. And so they hear reason as an attempt to say, no, but reason's not fallen. You can use reason somehow and save yourself or whatnot,
Yeah.
versus, well, reasoning is fallen,
Right.
but the laws of logic aren't fallen.
Correct. Right.
And so that's another thing I thought we'd really need to reclaim that in Reformed tradition. And I think one of the areas I study is Old Princeton, and I think Charles Hodge and Warfield did a great job on discussing that reality of reason, natural revelation, and then special revelation.
Yeah. The closest if I belong to a school, philosophical school, the closest would be the old Princetonian
Mm-hmm.
Scottish common sense realism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's right. It seems like I encountered them in secular university going through Religion in America. And the main thing I learned was that Charles Hodge said, in my time at Princeton, no new ideas entered Princeton.
Yeah.
And then we move on to whatever else was after that. And that's thought to be obviously this guy is nuts. Instead
Yeah.
of saying, well, wait a minute, how did no new ideas come in? Well, because he demolished all of them with
Right.
arguments.
Right.
As opposed to just a compelled. No, none of my students can believe anything that comes out of liberal theology.
Right.
Well, hey, I just want to thank you, Pastor Wilson, for your time today and talking about these things and your work. I'm glad that you still go to secular universities and you offer them the opportunity. Too bad they don't accept that and
Right.
actually get into a debate about the truth of Christianity.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being with you.